On April 15, 2004, a client walked into a salon and found it empty. The hairstylist had vanished during a 13-minute gap between appointments. Her car was still outside. The salon was undisturbed. Somewhere between one appointment and the next, she was gone. What began as a missing person case would fracture a family and raise difficult questions about a husband who insisted she would never leave, and a son still searching for the truth. If you appreciate atmospheric and immersive storytelling, I hope you'll subscribe. Now, be still and join me for the story of Patrice Endres. Just before noon on April 15, 2004, Patrice Endres was standing behind her chair, finishing a haircut the way she had finished thousands before. She put down her scissors, unclipped the barber's cape, then brushed off the few hairs that landed on the nape of her client's neck. Her salon, Tambour's Trim and Tan, wasn't large, but business was steady, and she had become somewhat of a staple in her community. The salon sat along a modest Georgia roadway, but despite its somewhat remote location, there was always a stream of regulars flowing in and out, with nothing but a few minutes between them. Patrice loved staying busy and styling hair, and being able to become close with so many of her customers just made her job that much more enjoyable. Having to keep track of so many back-to-back appointments had led Patrice to be very organized, with her days divided into small, predictable segments of time, each one accounted for. Her days ran on rhythm: appointment, conversation, payment, reset. If your name was in her book, she was ready. Inside that room, Patrice knew exactly what was happening, and she was in complete control. Outside the salon, her life wasn't as neat and tidy. Patrice's home life carried a different rhythm. She lived with her husband, Rob Endres, and her teenage son, Delves Wade, known to most people as Pistol. Rob wasn't Pistol's biological father. He'd come into Patrice's life later, and like many blended families, the arrangement required adjustment. Pistol was 14 that year, old enough to notice the small shifts inside a household, the pauses in conversations, the moments where voices changed tone. Patrice often moved quietly between the two, not dramatically, just the subtle work of keeping a home balanced. Most families have tensions that never reach the surface, small frictions that settle back down once the day moves on. And for a long time, Patrice was the one who made sure they did. That morning had begun the same way most did. She'd woken early and stepped onto the treadmill, the hum of it carrying faintly through the house. Pistol had been in a hurry for school, eager to get there early. He thought Patrice was taking too long, so he complained, and they ended up having a brief argument over it. Nothing explosive, just the friction of a rushed morning. She brought him to school, told him she loved him, and made her way to the salon. A client who saw her later that morning would recall that she seemed slightly distracted. Not frightened, not upset, just less focused than usual. By late morning, she was back in rhythm. Nothing about the day suggested it would end differently. One client finished shortly after 11 a.m. Another came and went not long after. At 11:35, the phone rang. Patrice answered. The caller would later say she sounded brief, shorter than normal. Usually Patrice would have long conversations with her regulars about their lives and the latest town gossip, but this call only lasted about 2 minutes. She had another appointment scheduled before noon, enough time to reset the chair, wipe the tools, maybe warm up the lunch she brought from home. At 11:50, the phone rang again. No one answered. A few minutes later, her next scheduled client pulled into the parking lot. They expected the usual greeting, the sound of movement from inside, the familiar presence behind the chair. Instead, silence. The room looked ready, but it was totally empty. Chair positioned, tools aligned, everything was set up for a haircut. She called out for Patrice, thinking maybe she was in a back room or something, but no one responded. She thought for a moment that maybe Patrice had gone out for a quick errand. Unusual, but possible. Looking around the room more closely, she saw Patrice's personal items were still there. Her purse was on the counter, her keys right beside it. Then she noticed what looked like Patrice's lunch just sitting there, untouched. The only strange thing, besides Patrice being gone, was the cash drawer. It was open. The salon wasn't overturned or ransacked, just open and empty. And Patrice was gone. When officers arrived at the salon, they found exactly what the client had described. The room was ready for a haircut, but Patrice Endres was gone. They cleared the front room first, then the back area. The restroom, storage spaces. They called out her name. No response. No break-in. No sign of a struggle. The open cash drawer suggested a robbery at first glance, but the amount missing was small, inconsistent with a planned theft. Her purse was still there. None of her expensive tools or scissors were taken. Robbing a salon for petty cash is one thing. Kidnapping someone in broad daylight is another. Her vehicle sat in the parking lot, though parked differently than usual, according to those familiar with her habits. In a life built on repetition, even small deviations stand out. With no real clues as to what happened to Patrice, investigators began reconstructing the timeline of her day, leading up to the disappearance. Her last confirmed interaction was the 11:35 phone call. The caller's memory was clear. Brief conversation, nothing alarming. At 11:50, another call came through, but she didn't answer. Between those two moments, Patrice disappeared. In a salon that ran on schedule, in the middle of a workday, she vanished. Witness statements added complexity to an already unusual situation. Two separate individuals reported seeing a blue sedan parked unusually close to the building during the critical 13-minute window. Descriptions varied, possibly a Chevrolet Lumina, maybe a Ford Taurus. One recalled it had a Georgia Wildlife license plate. Another witness described seeing Patrice near the doorway with another person, their hands touching, whether in greeting or something more tense, she couldn't say. Another reported seeing a man with shoulder-length hair nearby. The details overlapped enough to be taken seriously, but not enough to form a face. Phone records showed no outgoing calls from Patrice after 11:35. Voluntary departure was considered, but there was no indication she intended to leave. The room looked paused mid-motion. Something came in during those 13 minutes, and took Patrice with it. And without direction, there was only one question on investigators' minds. Where is Patrice Endres? In the days after Patrice vanished, attention moved outward. Roadways, businesses nearby, possible suspects. Investigators mapped the 13-minute window. Who had passed the salon? Who might have seen something? But inside her home, the tension that had once been managed was now exposed. Patrice had been the stabilizing presence in that house. Her son Pistol had grown up with her as his center. Rob Endres had come later. He wasn't Pistol's biological father, and the space between them had never fully settled. Pistol described the relationship as strained long before Patrice disappeared. Not violent, but constant. Small clashes over authority, over rules, over who had the right to decide how the house should run. Patrice often stood between them, absorbing the friction before it turned into something worse. When she vanished, that buffer disappeared with her, and the balance inside the home shifted almost immediately. Pistol has publicly said that not long after his mother went missing, Rob forced him out of the home. He was still a teenager, 14 years old, and suddenly, the place he had been living, the place where his mother still might return, was no longer accessible to him. He says he wasn't allowed back inside, not to gather his belongings, not to walk through the rooms she had just lived in, not even to retrieve photographs of her. Clothes, personal items, memories, all of it stayed behind. Rob later acknowledged that decision. When asked about it, he said simply that he didn't want Pistol in the house. I didn't like him. The explanation was blunt, almost casual. Grief can fracture a household, but grief layered with old conflict can harden into something more. And in the absence of Patrice, the one person who had kept the peace, the divide became permanent. Pistol waited for answers. Rob waited too. When questioned about his marriage, he described their relationship with certainty. He said she loved him deeply, that she would never leave. While not unusual for a spouse to feel confident in their marriage, some of what he said caught people off guard. He referred to her as his Barbie doll, a phrase meant perhaps as affection, but one that felt strangely possessive when heard in the context of a missing woman. None of those statements are evidence of a crime, but investigators looked closely at Rob. They examined timelines, receipts, alibis, and in the end, no charges were filed. No evidence conclusively tied him to Patrice's disappearance. But inside the house she once held together, the silence that followed her absence never settled into peace. Only distance. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months. Investigators searched, and still, nothing. Until one day, the silence broke. Nearly 20 months after Patrice vanished, human remains were discovered in a wooded area in Dawson County, Georgia. The location was remote, uneven terrain, lightly traveled, not easily visible from the road. Dental records confirmed the identity. It was Patrice. For her son, the waiting ended that day, but relief did not come with it. The condition of the remains limited what investigators could determine. Exposure to weather, soil, and animal activity had erased many of the indicators forensic examiners rely on. The case was ruled a homicide, but that classification didn't bring a resolution. No suspect was formally charged. The question of Patrice's whereabouts was finally answered, but despite being found, there was still no answer to what happened in those 13 minutes. After Patrice's remains were returned, another layer of conflict surfaced. Rob retained possession of her remains. For a short period of time, he also kept her skull. He described carrying it around the house, sitting with it, talking to it. He even said he slept beside it, like a teddy bear. For Pistol, the whole ordeal was almost too much to bear. Not only were his mother's remains being treated in such a possessive way, but he wasn't even allowed to view them, not allowed to grieve on his own terms. For him, the discovery brought confirmation, but not closure. In interviews, he described the experience as losing his mother twice. Once when she vanished, and again when her remains were beyond reach. Grief doesn't follow a single pattern. Some people hold on tightly, some refuse to let go. But when grief and control overlap, it can fracture what little remains intact. Years passed, the case remained unsolved. No confession, no arrest, no definitive narrative. In October of 2023, Rob Endres passed away. After his death, Patrice's remains were returned to her family. For the first time in years, Pistol had access to what had been withheld. But even that return didn't answer the questions that began in those 13 minutes many years ago. Rob's actions raised difficult questions. The way he spoke about Patrice, the certainty that she would never leave, the control he held over what remained of her. Investigators examined those questions carefully. But suspicion isn't proof, and in the end, no charges were ever filed. What remains is something simpler and harder to resolve. A woman vanished between appointments, a mother was taken in 13 minutes, and a son was left to grow up without the one person who held his world together. Thank you for spending time with me on the story of Patrice Endres. If it left an impression, I hope you'll subscribe for more stories. If you'd like to support the work, a like and turning on notifications goes a long way. I hope to see you next time. Until then, be still.